Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to today's Foreign Policy Virtual Dialogue, Investing in Resilience from the Ground Up. Today, we'll explore how community-led development can foster growth and security in fragile countries and economies, and focus on efforts across the Sahel, the Horn, and the Great Lakes regions of Africa. My name is Allison Carlson, and I'm the Managing Director of FP Analytics, Foreign Policies Research and Advisory Division. And it's my pleasure to be your host for the next hour. In just a moment, I'll be joined by leading policy experts and practitioners in international development, who will shed light on how support for local entrepreneurship can support stability and self-sustaining growth, especially in post-conflict areas. These efforts are ever more important as vulnerable communities are grappling with the impacts of the global pandemic. This conversation will also shed light on some of the main findings highlighted in our newest report, which is a study commissioned by the U.S. African Development Foundation. Our research evaluated key drivers of economic and social resilience across African communities in these specific regions, the Sahel, the Horn, and the Great Lakes of Africa, and the impacts that community-led development and support for local entrepreneurship in particular can have. The report also highlights opportunities for governments, multilateral organizations, and the private sector to address gaps in development finance and scale the positive impacts of community-focused funding models. So a big thanks first to the U.S. African Development Foundation for the support of this initiative. So before we get started, I want to start with a few housekeeping notes, just so everyone can be as engaged as possible. We have folks joining us from all over the world, and I think hundreds, over 800 so far, participants in today's webinar. So thank you all for joining us. And we want this to be as interactive as possible, although it's virtual. So if you're joining us on Zoom and you have a question, when it comes to mind, please click the Q&A button on Zoom. I think we're all quite familiar with the process by now, but submit your questions as they come to you. And please identify yourself by name and the organization that you're joining us from. If you're joining us today by phone or by live stream, you can email us your questions. And the address for that is events@foreignpolicy.com. Also, feel free to chime into the conversation on social media using the hashtag #InvestInResilience4 Africa. So let's get started. To kick off the conversation, we're very pleased to have a video message from Congressman Dean Phillips, who unfortunately wasn't able to join us today for the conversation live, but he wanted to share some thoughts with all of you today on this very important topic, which is a key priority for him. So let's kick off the program and let's turn over to the video.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Representative Dean Phillips, and thank you for the invitation to join Foreign Policy Analytics and the U.S. African Development Foundation for the launch of their report, Investing in Resilience from the Ground Up. Now, I am encouraged, very encouraged, by the election of Joe Biden and the potential return of American leadership and decency on the world stage. Now, at the same time, we cannot be lulled into the false belief that somehow everything is going to go back to normal. I'm reminded of the words of Thomas Jefferson today when he said that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Now, as we've seen all across the world, rising authoritarianism and attacks on democracy, even in America, we've seen the rise of conspiracy theories and a war on truth itself that are all being used by our enemies, both foreign and domestic. So no, things are not going to go back to normal. And like Mr. Jefferson, we must continue to be very vigilant. But as we look forward into the future, I do see the United States once again revitalizing our alliances, strengthening democratic institutions, and supporting economic growth and empowerment. But we cannot continue to do so alone. That is why it is vitally important to involve those in the communities in which we work. Grassroots organizations, civil society and religious leaders, and social entrepreneurs, because community-driven partnerships are the ones that lead to self-sustaining solutions. So let's get youth involved in this conversation. Experts say that by 2050, Africa's youth population will increase by 50%, making it by far the youngest continent in the world. Young people represent such great promise for innovation, entrepreneurship, and social change. Ensuring that they have the opportunity to follow their passions and get their businesses off the ground is critical to ensuring successful and safe communities. Now, as a small business owner myself, I understand that success is never possible without opportunity. And that is why, in my role on the Africa Subcommittee, that I'm such an advocate for USADF and projects like the Local Works Program at USAID. The United States of America can be such a force for good, but we must begin to think more critically about how to provide a more holistic approach to aid and development all around the world. We must ensure that our dollars are well accounted for and used transparently. However, those requirements should never be what comes between a young entrepreneur and his or her ability to help their community. Instead, let's work to ensure that these small, locally driven organizations have the capacity, the training, and the knowledge base to access U.S. capital and capacity building resources and to help them along the way. My home state of Minnesota is home to significant communities from Ethiopia, Liberia, and Somalia, to name a few. And it is my responsibility and my opportunity to engage on these issues and proudly represent those that have chosen to call Minnesota and our country home. So let's show the world the great American experiment still works, that we can indeed be the shining city on the hill. Indeed, a city that will be rebuilt brick by brick. We have a long and some challenging days ahead, but I'm hopeful for the future, and I encourage all of you to keep the faith. And just remember, optimism is just as contagious as fear. Thanks, everybody.
And thank you to the Congressman for that important message and for starting us off today. And it really tees up nicely our opening segment looking at policy and interagency collaboration to foster stability across Africa. I'd like to introduce now our first panel. And joining us today are Congressman David Price, Democrat from North Carolina's 4th District, C.D. Glin, President and CEO of USADF, and Corinne Graff, Senior Advisor at the U.S. Institute for Peace. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to kick it off, I'd like to transition over to you, Congressman, and hear another voice from Congress about the role of community-led development in stability across Africa, both at home and abroad. And from your perspective, what is the role of community-led development, and what are some of the policies that the U.S. government can implement to help facilitate development in these regions?
Thank you. I appreciate the chance to join you and to comment on what I believe is the central question of our discussion today, and that is the role of development and community-led development in particular in terms of the stability, the legitimacy, the democratic development of the countries of Africa in particular. I come at this from two institutional perches, and I'll just briefly refer to each within the Congress. I'm a member of the State and Foreign Operations Appropriations Subcommittee, and I'm also the chairman of the House Democracy Partnership. From the standpoint of our Appropriations Subcommittee, we are, I think, on a bipartisan basis, strong proponents of aid, development aid, flexible development strategies. We've made good on that in our negative responses, I would say, to the Trump budget proposals that would have merged this work, the ADF work, with USAID, and would have drastically reduced the funding. We explicitly forbade the folding of these programs together, and we increased the budget proposal from less than 5 million to 33 million, as everybody on this call knows. We've also been champions for responding to COVID, although I would say those efforts have fallen short and very much need to be addressed with the relief bills going forward. From the House Democracy Partnership Purse, this is the bipartisan commission now celebrating our 15th anniversary, where we are working member to member, staff to staff, peer to peer with parliaments in emerging democracies. We're working directly and have done so for 15 years quite persistently with the parliaments of Kenya and Liberia. And we've also done exploratory work in places like Ethiopia and the Gambia. And we fully appreciate, I think, and have come more to appreciate over the 15 years, the intricate interrelationship of good governance and economic success. And of course, development aims at economic success. The countries we're working with, these fragile emerging democracies, need to demonstrate economic success. They need to show that democracy is not only consistent with, but promotes economic success and a widely distributed economic success. And of course, that's the goal of the kind of flexible development strategy that ADF promotes. And so we find ourselves on HDP, we find ourselves advocating for our countries, for the countries we're working with, for aid, for trade, for investment, for the MCC, for example, which explicitly combines the goals of good governance and economic development, advocating for MCC engagement in these countries, and so on. So I come at this forum today and the work of ADF with a full appreciation for the particular flexibility and community-based development programs you're talking about, and their unique value. They are quite unique, and I think have a unique potential, and also the interlocking of these programs with other goals, with broader developmental goals, with goals of stability, legitimacy, democratic governance, and that, you know, the work we're doing, focusing on the governance part of that, simply cannot succeed unless we can also at the same time bring along these countries economically. And of course, that's what you're all about. So I'm happy to be part of this discussion today and to contribute whatever I might in terms of our experience.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Congressman, for joining us. And absolutely agree that those partnerships between governments are so important, and partnerships also on the ground. And I'd like to bring CD in now to address some of the impacts that ADF has had and your experiences working with local communities on the ground. I know this is your anniversary year, and I'd love if you could share some perspective on the partnerships and the role that those partnerships have had in being able to work with communities on the ground.
Thanks so much, Allison. Thank you for your leadership of foreign policy analytics. Congressman Price, really appreciate those fantastic words for setting the stage. You and Congressman Phillips are true champions of development, and development done differently, development that impacts people's lives and livelihoods in all facets. And so at the U.S. African Development Foundation, we truly appreciate the support, the bipartisan support that we get from Congress to exist. Allison, you mentioned this being our anniversary year. So this year, actually tomorrow, is our birthday, if you will. 40 years ago in 1980, President Carter signed into law the African Development Foundation Act, which established us to be an organization, an agency of the U.S. government that directly supports African communities, that puts them on a pathway to prosperity, that really focuses on giving those communities a voice and a choice in their own development, and truly is a bottom-up driven, local engagement, inclusive model of development that leads to real local ownership of solutions. And we have seen now more than ever the need for this bottom-up driven, locally owned solutions, especially amidst the COVID-19 global pandemic, a health crisis, which became and is becoming an economic crisis, as well as a food security crisis all over the continent. And on top of that, in communities that were already communities in crisis, whether it be climatic or whether it be conflict. And so we've been tested more than ever in this year. While we are turning 40, we're almost like a 40-year-old startup, because we are really engaged with making sure that our model delivers for those who are most in need during these challenging times. So we don't do it alone. We do it 100% aligned to the broader U.S. goals and foreign policy for Africa, and whether that be Power Africa, Global Food Security Act with Feed the Future, whether that be AGOA, focused on trade and investment, or anything related to youth and youth employment and entrepreneurship, as you've seen in Yali. And most recently, the Global Fragility Act, and I'm sure Corinne, in her great leadership and role at USIP and previously at USAID, is going to talk a little bit about the Global Fragility Act. So I won't dive deeper there. But this has been a transformational year. We've had to look at our model and say, what do those communities that are going through this global pandemic, what do they really need, and how can we be of most support? And so we looked at this in three ways. We looked at the importance of helping communities understand and withstand COVID-19 so that they could survive, adapt, and thrive in face of it. And so we took a look at what Congress was doing for the U.S. People and population and the CARES Act. And Congressman Price and Congressman Phillips, who spoke, real champions of making sure that we're taking care of home as we do look abroad. And so ADF established our own CARES Act, and this was capital for African resilience, building, and enterprise support. So this was immediate capital for those agricultural enterprises, those grassroots communities that were going through the challenges of COVID-19, giving them immediate operational support and working capital so that the economic development opportunities and activities that they were engaged in, that they could be not only survive, they could adapt and they can thrive in the face of it. So that was immediate capital, up to $5 million to 350 businesses, enterprises, community organizations throughout the continent. We've seen real resilience in these same communities, and it wasn't like African communities were waiting to be saved by the largesse of the U.S. government or U.S. African Development Foundation. They were on their way, and we helped them reconfigure and pivot some of their businesses. And this is shea butter cooperatives and palm oil producers producing soap and sanitizers and local washing stations so that they could really look at the realities around stopping the spread. We saw water and sanitation organizations in communities and urban slums like Kibera, where the Congressman has visited before. Kibera in Nairobi, Kenya, look at water and sanitation and make hand washing stations really available in densely populated urban areas. We saw off-grid energy enterprises, mini grid operators, take their businesses and reconfigure them to rural hospitals and vaccination clinics and isolation to really look at the opportunity to be a part of the solution to respond to COVID-19. And then also around the development of PPE, personal protective equipment, handicraft producers, garment manufacturers, making masks and smocks and gloves and any number of things. So our entrepreneurs, the community enterprises, have been able to respond to COVID-19, but not alone. And this is in conjunction with working with other agencies, whether that's MCC and the work we're doing with MCC around climate resilience in Niger, work with Power Africa and USAID around off-grid energy, working with the private sector. And I'm really excited that on this call, one of our newest partners is the National Basketball Association Players Foundation. And we'll hear from Sherrie Deans, who's really going to talk about individuals, private individuals who are committed to these communities in ways that is untenable, ways in which they want to invest directly back into some of their home communities that they feel a direct connection to and have a real responsibility for. And so different partners, different actors coming into the space. ADF wants to be a part of long-term, locally driven solutions, and we want to be a model for doing development differently. Bring in other government actors, bring in the private sector, such as the National Basketball Players Association Foundation, bringing in organizations, whether it's Citibank and focusing on youth development. So we see our models being locally driven, but in collaboration and conjunction with others. And we only survive, adapt, and thrive to the challenges facing Africa with the support that we get from Congress, from the private sector, and from African governments themselves. So we ourselves are a model for collaboration, and we're a small agency, but we have a big impact on the continent, and we, in our work, has never been more important than what we see now happening throughout the continent as the continent responds to COVID-19.
Absolutely. And as you said, CD, we're all in this together. And I think COVID-19 has taught us more than ever the importance of international collaboration and partnership. And stemming from your comments, and I'd like to turn over to Corinne, I'm curious about your perspective from USIP about the role of community-led development, particularly in fragile states. I know you've worked across the continent for quite some time and with the National Security Council as well prior to your role at USIP. I'm wondering from your perspective, what role can community-led development really play going forward? And what is the role of these partnerships with USIP, USADF, and others?
Good morning, and thank you very much, Allison. It's an honor to be part of this discussion and the launch of your new report, so thank you so much for having me. And I want to thank CD Glin for his leadership of the African Development Foundation and Congressman Dean and Price for their opening remarks. USIP also benefits from strong bipartisan congressional support, so we're very thankful for that support. So the U.S. Institute of Peace, for those of you who don't know us, is an independent, nonpartisan national institute funded by Congress. And we're active in 52 countries. And over the past year have been looking at the impacts of the coronavirus pandemic on conflict dynamics around the world. And to answer your question, Allison, we think at USIP that working at the grassroots level is really key. It's a peace building best practice. And I think in post-conflict environments, community development programs have tended to be much more effective than top-down programs that tend to be imposed by international donors. I think the main challenge that we face as a government, and I think the Congressman and Mr. Glin alluded to this, is that our systems, our budget cycle, our procurement systems are generally not structured to allow U.S. development agencies to work at this level. So that's the challenge. And I think the African Development Foundation, and I would say also USIP, are an exception in this regard. And the Congressman alluded to this as well, but you need the flexibility in these contexts to be able to program across sectors in response to needs on the ground in fluid conflict environments. And you need to be able to adapt quickly to changing conditions. So that's critical. And it's difficult for large development organizations to do. It's also difficult for multilateral agencies that are spending the bulk of the funding, particularly in the context of COVID and the global response to COVID in these countries, but have difficulty doing this type of subnational work because they're working primarily with governments. So I think the constraints facing large development agencies place a real premium on more nimble organizations like the African Development Foundation and like USIP. And I think that we also, at the same time, need to be thinking about how we can adapt our approach to development, the aid architecture in the US, I think the aid architecture globally as well, to working more at the grassroots level. As we argue in a new USIP report, if I could mention this, that was released last week on addressing fragility in the context of a global pandemic, we really need to prioritize this kind of work. And I think it's very important that organizations like the ADF and USIP are doing this, but I think we do need to be thinking about how to do this more broadly. I'd say another challenge that we face in the context of the pandemic and to doing this is that we really need to be prioritizing peace building programs and the kinds of programs that you describe in your report in the face of the pandemic, because what we're seeing is that large development agencies are pivoting away from some of our peace building programs and organizations to fund the emergency relief that is clearly necessary as well. But I think if we see too much of a swinging of the pendulum, the risk is that if we're not sustaining some of these peace building programs and grassroots programs, that countries could slide back into conflict. So we really need to keep our eye on the ball of addressing conflict risks and fragility while we're also responding to the massive food, health, and economic repercussions of the pandemic.
Thank you, Corinne. And that perfectly leads into a question I wanted to ask CD in terms of keeping your eye on the ball. I know that you've been active in local communities across these three regions that we're focusing on today for decades. And I'm wondering how specifically in the context of COVID-19, ADF has been able to pivot and be flexible in the way that you're supporting communities to enable continuity for business, to enable those entrepreneurs who you have supported to go forward and to be responsive and agile to the needs that they need to address on the ground.
Thanks, Allison and Corinne. Thank you for those great comments. I mean, I think you nailed it with relationship to USIP and USADF being part of the solution set, but not enough. There's not enough of us, and where the support that we get is not enough to really for the outside challenges that we all face. So really appreciate the work that USIP is doing, and it is complementary to the work of ADF. And I think that's really important in that there's a development continuum that we're looking at, from humanitarian assistance to development finance, and looking at these unique tools in the toolkit is how we can bring about transformational change at the grassroots level, from the bottom up perspective to real growth and scale. We talk at ADF about finding, funding, and supporting local solutions, local actors, to develop them, to grow them, to really scale them. And it is about the linkages that we need to provide. And ADF's model, again, hasn't necessarily changed over the last 40 years because we're 100% demand responsive and demand driven. And so the challenges of today, or the challenges of yesterday, or the challenge of tomorrow, we're going to be adaptive in meeting those because we directly respond to Africans' needs and challenges in those communities. So this direct support and this demand responsive approach is what's leading to our ability to be part of the solution. Again, in isolated places around the continent that are often left behind. We all talk about the last mile, but ADF talks about that's the first mile of development for us. It's where our work really begins, and it's really essential that we're in those communities so those communities can become stronger and more resilient, so that they can be better contributors to the broader economic development that's happening around these various countries. And so this direct support is important, that we're really talking about local solutions, so local needs and challenges. Flexibility has been said again and again, and that's really critical. Agility needs to be there, and we need to focus on long-term planning, but also short-term interventions as well. And so having a model that does help people respond to the challenges that they're facing today, but also look to the future as well. We talk about COVID-19 in conflict-affected areas amidst climate change. These are the latest challenges, but we know they won't be the last. And so we want to make sure that we're truly building resilience for the long term for these communities. And as I said, providing direct working capital, business continuity support to meet the immediate challenges, to help these communities pivot in the face of COVID-19. The supply chains were shut down. There was quarantine, there was lockdowns. There's many things that they had to adapt to. And so how are we a part of the solution in doing that? And because we are a grant funder, so we have working capital grants, we have operational assistance grants up to $250,000 that goes directly to the communities. We support them with local technical assistance from local actors. So all of our implementing partners, all of our local partners are from the countries and communities that we're working with. So that capital is important. The combination of the local capacity building is there. And then to learn these lessons and share them across communities, whether in the Horn, the Sahel, or the Great Lakes regions, has been really critical to our success. But again, we've seen a real sense of resilience from the communities, and we've seen them be able to look at things like digitization in a new way. And one example is a young woman who was a recipient of a Young African Leaders grant from us, who was able to, during COVID-19, Mabato Mokiti, she founded a digital marketplace. This was in South Africa, Redshift's local store connector, to connect consumers to small businesses in their South African township communities, and to facilitate delivery of services, allowing customers to practice social distancing, raising the visibility of local shops that were open during COVID-19 lockdown. So we've seen communities be able to look at solutions, but we need to be there for them with the kind of support that they need, whether that's capacity building and training support, whether that's financing, early stage financing that leads to long-term growth, or whether it's making the connections and giving them more visibility. So we've seen, again, communities be able to not only survive, but to adapt and thrive in the face of COVID-19. And we're really proud of the work that we're doing at the local level that leads to long-term transformational change in these communities.
Great, thank you. And I think those are some incredibly powerful, concrete examples of the work that's being done on the ground. And to both of your points, Corinne and CD, about long-term planning as well, we have a policy question coming in from the audience that I would like to field, and this is directed to Congressman Price. This is coming from Subhanu Kanal. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, from Kathmandu in Nepal. And he asks, while US aid policy emphasizes heavily on increasing GDP of countries that it's engaged with, a cursory review of economies across Africa shows that the issue there is really one of income inequality and shared prosperity, which sadly contribute to state fragility and entrepreneurial handicap. What is US government to address income inequality on the ground? And I think, CD, certainly you spoke to several of the projects that you've been focused on as well. And I'm wondering, in terms of a long-term policy perspective and priorities that you're setting in Congress, Congressman, I'd love to turn it over to you.
Well, it's a very important question, and I think the discussion today is, I hope, going to illuminate the way we should approach this. We do need to pay attention to GDP. We need to pay attention to overall levels of trade and investment, and that those are relevant, important indicators, but they're not qualitative, and they certainly don't fully address the questions of distribution of income, distribution of economic well-being, and equality and inequality within the societies. And so we need, in our aid programs in general, I think, to ask these questions. But one of the virtues, I mean, a leading virtue of the ADF kind of approach is that it operates at that micro level, it operates at that community level, and it is meeting communities and individuals where they are, and enabling them to achieve their goals. And I think it's absolutely critical to get aid at that level and to pay attention to real community impacts, including the lifting of people out of poverty and the alleviation of deprivation that so often characterizes these countries, quite apart from what the macroeconomic indicators look like. If I might, just one parallel that occurs to me, I think when we talk about our work in HDP, we think that we're reforming congressional relationships with our partner countries in a similar way to the way ADF is reforming foreign aid. We've had enough of these congressional delegations that go in and meet the president and the prime minister and then go on to the next country. That is not adequate to our own understanding, much less to the signals we want to send to these countries. We need to be there long term. We need to engage for days at a time. We need to, of course, have interchange with our parliamentary counterparts, but we also need to visit ADF projects and talk to people on the ground who are engaged in these. As Mr. Jen referred to our visits to Carolina for Cabrera in Nairobi. That's, of course, has a North Carolina connection, so that helps explain it. But there's a purpose in that. There's a purpose in showing support for that kind of work and understanding that the kind of work that's going on with ADF and similar efforts is integrally related to democracy, the goals of equality, greater equality, and the kind of legitimacy, the kind of performance that a democracy has to demonstrate if it's going to take hold.
Thank you for that. And one last question over to Corinne, if I may, regarding long-term planning as well. I know prior to USIP, as I mentioned, you were with the NSC and really working on interagency planning. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, from where you sit now and from your experience in the past, what are some of the lessons learned and what should be some of the priorities that we can think about going forward as a new administration is coming in, and some of the priorities for greater interagency collaboration to have impact on the ground?
Thank you for that, Allison. If I may, I think this is an excellent opportunity to turn to the Global Fragility Act that CD Glin mentioned, because it pertains to your question. So we have a new law in the US as of last year, the Global Fragility Act, which addresses some of these issues exactly. It's a very ambitious measure that aims to overhaul the way the US engages in countries that are vulnerable to conflict. especially fragile states where the social contract between citizens and the state is severed and societies are fragmented and prone to violence. And that issue of legitimacy that the Congressman just mentioned is so critical in those contexts. And the approach that the Global Fragility Act puts forth comprises three elements. The first is the development of a US government-wide strategy for addressing conflict's root causes through US assistance, as well as country plans that prioritize conflict prevention and stabilization as US objectives. So I think the legislation recognizes that we need to be deliberate about using our investments to promote peace and stability. And we have to elevate prevention as a policy priority and really exercise leadership on that. The second element of the bill is what Allison was asking about, which is that we need to better align US assistance in countries that are vulnerable to conflict. This is an age-old challenge, of course, but it's particularly important in these countries where that lack administrative capacity and the capacity themselves to do the coordination. So we need to ensure that development agencies are working together, and we also need to ensure that our security assistance is not undermining what we're doing on the development side. So there's that critical interagency piece, which is always important, but particularly in these countries. And then the third element that's in the bill, in my view, is that we need to be doing the kind of assistance and the kind of work that the ADF is doing. Working with local actors in communities who have a stake in their own development. And as the Congressman was emphasizing over and over again, really meeting them where they are and supporting their own priorities. We know that is what works. We know that's really important in contexts like Afghanistan, but also just in fragile contexts that are vulnerable to conflict. Building relationships with stakeholders in those communities over time, so we have a better sense of their needs and priorities. I couldn't agree more with what C.D. Glin said about that. It's not just that we need the flexibility, we also need to be there in the long term if we want to see our investments sustained and have a sustainable impact. And then working inclusively with marginalized groups, women and youth, and building building local capacity and resilience to address shocks and resolve conflicts in the communities and in the countries so that they can take over these functions over the longer term. So I really think that the ADF model adheres to many of these best practices that are in the Global Fragility Act. And of course, the question is, how do we get more agencies across the US government to engage with that framework?
Thank you. And I think you've all really underscored the importance of interagency collaboration in that effort, both to respond to near-term acute needs on the ground, as well as longer-term needs going forward for both economic development and stability. So I really appreciate all of you joining us today and sharing your perspectives and all of your continued work on these issues. And thank you again to USADF for your work and support of our study. We're unfortunately out of time for the first panel. So I would like to transition now to our next conversation. However, we'll invite all of you back at the end to address some of the questions that have been coming in from our audience. So thank you again for that. And so now, actually, this is stemming directly from Corinne's last comments about impact and understanding the degree of impact for some of these projects. And I'd like to take a moment to highlight some of the key findings from our study and the recommendations that came from the report. And to help me do that, I would like to invite Isabelle Schmidt to join us. She's my colleague, and she's one of the analysts who led the research on this project, along with our colleague, Fouad Pervez. So thank you, Isabelle, and please unmute your microphone and join us.
Hi, thanks. I'm really excited to be here.
Hi, Isabelle. So as you know, one of our goals with this project was to really understand the impact that community-led development models are having on economic growth and stability, and stemming from our previous conversation. And actually, this addresses one of the questions that was coming in from the audience, which was from David Phillips. And he was asking, from a data and evidence perspective, what performance metrics do we have and how can we really show that these programs are successful? And that was really one of the goals of our study and objectives, looking at the USADF projects and way that community-led funding can really impact lives and livelihoods on the ground. And so from a researcher's perspective, could you share with us and with the audience, how do you measure that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And there are obviously a lot of different approaches that you could take. Our team attacked it from two angles, so a quantitative data analysis and then a qualitative interview process. It was really important to us because of the community-led nature of this model to really foreground the experiences and the insights of the grantees themselves. So entrepreneurs, small businesses, and cooperatives who are working with USADF or who've received grant funding from them in the past to really understand the work that they're doing and the plans that they have for the future, and also the impact that that relationship with USADF, both in terms of the grant funding and the support that their implementing partners and their technical partners have offered in terms of capacity building, business growth, and things like that. So we interviewed over 50 grantees, as well as staff and implementing partners in the countries that we were focused on in the Sahel, the Great Lakes, and the Horn of Africa. And then on the other side, the quantitative aspect, we analyzed data, and this was really spearheaded by Fouad, our colleague. We analyzed data from over 1,100 USADF grants that have been awarded since 1996 in their three key grant-making sectors. And we looked at the measurable outcomes that we could find and created a return on investment model to better understand how far that money is going and what direct impacts it's having.
Okay, great. And could you break down for the audience too what key sectors the research looks at?
Yeah, so those three sectors are agriculture, off-grid energy access, and youth-led enterprise. So agriculture is USADF's main sector, and it's obviously incredibly important for understanding development and resilience in the region because it's still the largest employer of Africans, or either directly in agriculture or in related sectors. Off-grid energy is an area where ADF works with a number of different US agencies on things like Power Africa, and is a really interesting sector to look into because it's very much a grassroots and locally led project because it's separate from things like government-led extension of the national grid. And then youth-led enterprise is obviously, as was mentioned earlier, very important because Africa is an incredibly young continent and it's getting even younger. And so creating really fulfilling and productive jobs for young people is going to be a very important aspect of economic development, but also wider resilience and stabilization.
Sure. And I know that looking across the three regions and over 1,100 grants, as you mentioned, each project is obviously very different, but what were some of the metrics that you found or the impacts, direct impacts on jobs, on job creation that you found across the sectors?
Yeah, from a purely financial perspective, we found that there was a very clear return on investment for the grant funding that USADF and its partners are giving out. So we took an average across the different grants, and we looked at every $10,000 of grant funding spent and awarded to different sectors. And we found that in agriculture, every $10,000 led to 25 additional workers being hired. In youth-led enterprise, every $10,000 led to 19 additional workers being hired. And then in off-grid energy, every $10,000 led to 79 more people being connected to reliable electricity.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible when you think about those sorts of direct impacts on numbers of workers hired on average, of course, and job creation as having a direct impact, but also the multiplier effect, as we know, having additional income enables greater economic activity locally and provision of services and other needs that communities have on the ground. And, as we were noting in the first panel, the projects are really focused on these three regions in the Sahel, the Horn, and the Great Lakes. And from a research perspective as well, understanding that there's a financing gap that was mentioned in the first panel as well. Why, from your perspective, is this type of financing so important in these fragile states?
Well, there are a couple of different reasons. One, I think, very interesting statistic is that there is over $300 billion gap in financing for small and medium-sized enterprises in Africa, who are the majority of the organizations that ADF is working with. So filling that gap just on a base level is important in order to support entrepreneurs at the local level. But specifically, this research and a lot of what ADF does is focused on fragile states, as was talked about in the earlier panel. And while those states have a lot of unique stressors and factors that lead to their fragility, they do also often share a lot of the same characteristics. So low levels of state legitimacy and poor governance, vulnerability to climate change, vulnerability to conflict, including in recently post-conflict states that are vulnerable to sliding back into conflict, as we're seeing in Ethiopia at the moment, unfortunately. And then very unequal economic growth and development, which I think has been the theme of a lot of the questions coming in from the audience. And so working on bottom-up community-led development is a really interesting way of seeing whether supporting businesses at the local level and supporting them to do the work that they think is most necessary to build resilience in their own communities can create a more equal form of economic development, and one that really puts money in the pockets of people living potentially not in large urban centers and capital cities, which are often better serviced by governments, but in remote areas, in rural areas, and whether supporting those businesses then creates more money in local economies that has a broader stabilizing effect.
Yeah, I mean, one of the really compelling findings was the capacity of many of these small and local businesses to really fill some of those capacity gaps and service delivery gaps of national governments generally, but particularly in this time during COVID. And I know you spoke to so many entrepreneurs across the three regions, and I'm curious what stands out for you as one of the key examples of some of the agility and flexibility of the entrepreneurs themselves in a response to COVID.
Yeah, I was really lucky to be able to talk to so many people just doing really fascinating and interesting work in their communities. And obviously some of those entrepreneurs and those businesses are really just doing their best to survive through this acute emergency so that they can continue doing that work. But you're right, and as CD mentioned earlier as well, a lot of people have really pivoted or expanded their businesses to be immediate service providers during this time. And so one example that really stood out to me was Habiba Ali, who is an off-grid energy entrepreneur. She's actually spoken on FP panels before about her work. And she operates in northern Nigeria. She works through an all-female sales team that sells door-to-door, essentially off-grid energy solutions like home kits for solar power so that individual families can power their lights and electricity. And when COVID hit, she made use of emergency grant funding from ADF and also from other partners that she works with to supply all of those saleswomen with face masks, hand sanitizer, and other cleaning products. And they have been really frontline emergency workers going into those communities where they're known, where they're trusted, and disseminating preventative information and also equipment necessary to make sure that COVID doesn't spread into these rural communities where people are often quite far from hospitals and other health centers.
Yeah, and the resilience is really incredible and powerful stories coming from the ground and from the communities. And there's so much more in terms of detail, impacts, profiles that are in the report. Unfortunately, we're running short of time, so I'd like to invite everyone to visit the report. It's online at investinginafricanresilience.com, and you can find all of our analysis there, as well as profiles of many of the entrepreneurs themselves. And I'd like to transition now into another story from one of the entrepreneurs that was a focal point of our research as well. We have another video, and this is featuring CPNCK, which is a USADF grantee cooperative of coffee growers in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I think this provides a really incredible example of how investing in local entrepreneurship and cooperatives can contribute to stability. And that organization and cooperative provides a way for former child soldiers to contribute to their communities and make a living for their families. So if we can turn over to the video.
Depuis que la CPNCK existe, il y a eu beaucoup de changements. Nous avons eu à intégrer dans la CPNCK les ex-combattants que nous avons encadrés depuis 2013. Ces ex-combattants, ils étaient rejetés par la communauté. On pensait que celui qui vient de l'armée, devient voleur. Celui qui vient de l'armée, il est mal éduqué, il est brutal.
Nous sommes en train de l'exporter aux États-Unis d'Amérique. Et donc, nous venons de livrer un conteneur de café à Mighty Peace Coffee aux États-Unis. Nous venons de vendre aussi un conteneur de café à Starbucks au niveau des États-Unis. Nous venons de vendre également un conteneur de café à Tropicor en Suisse. On a vendu également un conteneur à Hakofko en Allemagne. Nous venons de vendre également 2 conteneurs de café à Maison Paix Jobin en France. Permettez-moi d'abord de remercier très sincèrement USADF, ASOP pour l'appui financier que nous avons reçu. Nous avons reçu un appui très important de 226 000 $. C'est suffisant. Avec cet appui, nous avons reçu un fonds pour soutenir notre capital de commercialisation du café.
Thank you for that. And that's a great transition into our final segment and our final panel for today's virtual dialogue. And now I'm excited to welcome our next group of distinguished speakers to provide a point of view on philanthropic investment in local communities, as well as implementing local capacity of development programs and technical support. So now I'd like to welcome Sherrie Deans, Executive Director of the National Basketball Players Association Foundation, Kindra Halvorson, Chief Transformation Officer of Technoserve, and Dr. Ahmed Issa, Director of the Institute for Practical Research and Training. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be here.
So, Dr. Ahmed, I'd like to turn it over to you to start off. And if you could provide a little bit of background for our audience on the work that you're doing with IPRT and the way that you're seeing your efforts on the ground, understanding you've worked with a number of organizations and small businesses in the region, how you're seeing them contribute to support stability in the region now during COVID-19.
Good morning to you all. I think I'm the only one in Africa now. So good morning to you all. Thank you for asking me to join this panel. First of all, I would like to say a word about USADF. I have been working in this part of the world for the past sorry, I have to shut this off. Technology. One of the experiences that I had over these past 25 years working with international NGOs is that large NGOs have developed their own tiered levels of NGOs. So you have an NGO city in New York that funds an NGO city in Nairobi that finally funds a grassroots group in a local community. By the time the funding and the projects reach these local communities, it has become tiny and tiresome. USADF and organizations like that are small, that fund directly, the local organizations like the coffee growers that we just saw are extremely important and extremely useful to grassroots development. If I take an example, for example, we've been talking about COVID. My organization runs a COVID hospital. We have a hospital that we turned over to a COVID dedicated treatment hospital right at the beginning of the pandemic. What we discovered in that very short period was that in our entire country, we had no ICU units, and we had no nurses that could take care of critical ill patients. We applied for a grant from USADF. Within a month and a half, we received it. We have trained right away 15 critical care nurses, and we're now treating another 75. So in a very short period of time, we have trained enough nurses to take care of about 30 ICU units. That's extremely important for us. And it's also important for the young people that have been trained, because now they have skills that are worthwhile, the skills that are outwardly moral and useful to them. So that now their employment is assured. So we're extremely grateful to CD Glin and USADF for the work that they do that directly deals with the local NGOs, rather than through a tiered system of NGOs. Having said that, what we have now in Africa is a young generations, young people. I think the statistics shows that in the next decade, 25% of the entire world population will be young people living in Africa. And these young people are quite different from the generations that I have been part of. They are connected, they are creative, like the group that we just saw in the video. And the way we deal with grassroots before, when we talk about grassroots, we talk about community participation. The way we talk about grassroots has to change now. It's a completely different environment. So we have to be able to now change our grassroots concepts to what these young people are going to do. What I see now is that these young people that are in Africa are extremely well connected. They are IT savvy. They are looking for upward mobility. The style of living in multi-generational families is changing. Their own housing needs are changing. So we have to deal in that environment, an environment that allows that creativity to develop. So we are extremely grateful to all organizations that, whether it's the Institute of Peace or USADF, for the work that they do directly with NGOs in Africa, with grassroots work in Africa. What's really extremely important for us is to understand that skills training, which is what we do and what many organizations do. Our organization, IPRT, does skills training. We have been doing it for about 7 years now. Other organizations, this is really the sort of the new item now is skills training. But skills training without economic development, it doesn't really work. When you train a young person for a skill, that skill has to be useful in the economy. So the economy has to be growing at the same time. So we cannot divorce skills training from economic development. And of course, economic development is also related to good governance. And so those three items, good governance, economic development, and grassroots, are all interlinked. And if we don't have that, if we don't have peace, in our society that's already going through post-conflict transformation, we don't have peace, we cannot have economic development. And the skills training that we give to young people will not be that important. They will not get jobs if there's no market, if the market is not growing. So we have to work in concert with all of those three systems: good governance, economic development, and skills training. And we have to also realize now in the jobs that we do now, that the skills that we have been training people for has to also transform with the requirements of the young people that we have now. The young people, instead of doing technical work only, we also have to do technology work at the same time. So we have to improve the quality of the work, the quality of the skills that we're doing. And we are at a point where in many African countries, we need to marry the requirements of the companies, whether it's engineering, whether it's construction, whether it's development, whether it's office work. We have to move with that. We have to, the skills that we're training young people for have to also go along with that. So what we have found over the past 7 years or 6 years that we have been doing this work is that every aspect in Africa with the new generation is growing. One example, for example, that a grant that USADF has given to one of our organizations is to, we have been doing skills training, whether it's carpentry or electricity or plumbing. We've been doing that for many years. Now we realize that when these people are trained, they have to get jobs. And the way to get jobs is to link them with the community. So we have partnered with our mobile provider to set up a system that's very similar to home advisory. Those of you who live in the US know what home advisory is. You type in, you need a plumber, you log in and you find a plumber in your neighborhood. So we have a system now. All the young people that we have trained in plumbing or carpentry are now registered in that program, and they're getting jobs directly from the community. So we have to also move with the technology, do new things, not only do the old grassroots. I mean, when I say old grassroots, I'm not, that's still useful. We need to still deal with stakeholders that are really needy in the community. We have to deal with those as well. But we have to realize that the young people that we are training now, the young people that are in Africa now, require more than just the rudimentary skills, the rudimentary help that we have been giving them. Now we have I was reading the FP analytical report, and one of the items that you have found, one of the findings, is that high school enrollment and high school graduation has been increasing steadily in Africa. That's extremely important. But what that also means is that we now find university graduates or high school graduates that are working as waiters. So like that you would find in the developed world, in New York or Washington.
Right.
And so we're changing with the entire African ecosystem is changing, and we have to deal with that, and we have to realize that we cannot just do things the old way. And organizations like USADF that respond quickly are well suited to do these sort of programs.
Absolutely. Thank you. If I could interject really quickly and build off what you're saying about capacity building and really focusing on skills development for the younger generation, I'd like to turn over to Kindra Halvorson. I know through Technoserve, you've been working across the continent for over 50 years as an organization and involved in 20 African countries. And I'm wondering from your perspective, what are some of the ways in which Technoserve is really working with younger generations to develop skills and capacity going forward?
Thank you. Thanks for having me this morning or this afternoon. And thanks for your great report, which I think really draws important attention to the work of partnering and supporting businesses in local markets to grow. I want to touch on your question, but jump off a point that Dr. Issa made, which is about needing economic development in conjunction with skills training. And our focus is on businesses, because businesses are what drive economic growth and economic development. So we work with smallholder farmers and small and growing businesses in about 27 countries around the world, half of those in sub-Saharan Africa, and help them capitalize on local market opportunities so that they can grow jobs and drive markets for smallholder farmers. What we've seen in the pandemic is that many of them have been cash flow constrained. Markets went away temporarily in some cases, and while those are starting to come back, many of those markets won't return in the short run or maybe even in the medium term. And so those businesses have been constrained in paying employees, constrained in paying smallholder farmers. We've responded in three major ways. The first is to aggregate what we're hearing from our clients around the world about the challenges that they're having so that we can respond to those, excuse me, but also reflect those needs back to the funders and other organizations that want to support them. Secondly, we've shifted, like many organizations, to a lot of remote service delivery, whether that's over phone calls or WhatsApp messaging, in some cases, in certain markets, online service delivery. And then third, through partnerships with organizations like USADF, we've put a lot more emphasis on grants and recoverable grants. Because we take a commercial market-based approach, we don't usually, as Technoserve, engage in that type of work. But the PPP loan that so many businesses in the US have benefited from aren't available in these markets. And so a partner like USADF has been really critical to come in and intervene and allow these businesses to keep paying their staff, to keep paying their employees, and to keep investing in their supply chains, which support the communities in which they operate. And that has been a third pivot for us.
You know, you've really underscored the importance of the partnerships and focusing on long-term development and also development of leaders. And I think something that was fascinating from the research that we were doing as well are the different types of partnerships that exist and those that are necessary going forward and filling different needs in and across the region. And so I'd like to turn it over now to Sherrie to get a perspective as well from a very unique and different type of partnership that is investing in the region and it's growing relationships, focusing on young leaders as well. And to get from your perspective, what is the National Basketball Players Association doing and how are you working to forge skill development and leadership across the region?
Well, it's so great to be here. Thanks for having me, Allison. I'm sure there are a lot of folks wondering what basketball has to do with this conversation. But the reality is that we are a very international league. 1/4 of our players come from outside of the United States, and we have players that represent 14 countries throughout Africa, and that number continues to grow. And they are exactly the type of profile that Dr. Issa mentioned. They're young, they're deeply connected, they're heavily invested. And I think the burden that they have is one that they can't let go, and that is they are responsible and accountable to advance their countries and their communities as they advance. And so they feel deeply connected to that. And for a lot of them, the old ways of operating just don't work. They don't resonate. Traditional investments don't work. Rigid structures don't work. They are not coming to Africa as strangers. They're coming to Africa and reinvesting in Africa as natives. And so they need to find ways to support the local business owner, their cousin, their uncle, their neighbor. And the way that we used to do philanthropy was very traditional. We'd find a US-based organization, they would make an investment there, and eventually the dollar that they gave in the United States would end up being 10 cents in Africa. And that just was not acceptable to them anymore. And so we had to evolve. We had to find new resources, new partners, and new ways of learning and connecting without building that infrastructure ourselves. And when we connected with CD Glin and the US African Development Foundation, it was clear that they were the kind of partner that could not only increase our understanding, but actually scale the investments that the players wanted to make. And so we have now a partner that has expertise in all the 14 countries that our current players are from, in addition to some other countries where our US-based players are making investments as well. And I think that's going to mean that our work is going to be more meaningful and more impactful for decades to come.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I think all of these conversations today have really underscored the importance of the different types of partnerships that are really bridging connections between the US and the region, but also other areas around the world as well. I know we're running a little bit short of time, and I'd like to bring in the other speakers as well, bring them back to the panel for some Q&A from our audience. If we could bring everyone back to the group, please, and bring them back on stage. Thank you all again for joining us today. And because we're running a little short of time, I'd like to pose a few questions for rapid response from the group. And first of all, I would like to go over to Corinne. We have a question from Jacqueline Reich of Chestnut Hill College in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And it's with respect to religious organizations. And she's stating that many African-based religious congregations, especially women religious organizations, have worked quietly but effectively in promoting education in their countries. And so she's wondering if USIP as well as USADF have relationships with religious groups that do much of the grassroots development in Africa. Corinne, and then CD, I'd turn that over to you as well.
Sure, Allison, the short answer is yes, absolutely. We work with religious organizations in Africa and around the world. And we also work with women's organizations. For example, in East Africa, there are networks that are focused on preventing violent extremism, and we work very closely with those groups of women and help build their capacity and help extend their networks across the continent and around the world. So yes, emphatically yes, but I won't speak for USADF.
No, you can, Corinne, because it's another yes and yes. We definitely work with religious organizations on the ground, and often find that they are the ones that have the real strong community connection, that people are connecting over their faith, and that we're able to build on that and leverage that, because that commitment to those communities is very deep, longstanding, and trusted. And so sometimes the best conduits for our support to be directly engaged is through religious organizations, community-based organizations, and those that feel a true long-term connection to the community. So yeah, an emphatic yes.
Great. And one of the connections to the community as well, I know there's been quite a bit of concern as of late with respect to food security and with the breaking of local supply chains and concern about agriculture in particular. And a question over to Kindra and Technoserve. Can you speak to some of the partnerships and some of the projects that you are working on that's directly addressing some of the issues of food security on the ground?
Sure, thank you. We work with food processors across 10 African countries, and we see these firms as really linchpins in the food systems. They both buy from smallholder farmers, they process that food safely, and they distribute it to consumers. We've been fortunate this year to launch a partnership with USADF and several other partners called the Coalition for Farmer Allied Intermediaries. That's really in its earliest stages. We're just getting going, and we hope to have many more partners come into that coalition over the next several months. But our focus is on working with agricultural intermediaries, those businesses that operate between farmers and between consumers, and that are interested in and see the business case for engaging farmers as valued suppliers. So not just extracting value from farmers, but creating value for the business and the farmers themselves. And together, we're trying to both bring attention to those businesses as linchpins in the food system, and bring more financing, more capital, and more technical assistance to help those businesses, in the first case, survive the pandemic and continue playing their critical role of moving food through the system, but in the longer term, become the really transformative engines for transformation in the food systems that they can be.
Great, thank you. And we have another one coming in about the role of US-based organizations and the impact that they can have. and it's pivoting back a bit, but Sherrie, I'd like to turn this one to you. So for US-based organizations, how can they really come together to foster growth in nations that may be grappling with solving some of the social issues and challenges, particularly with youth that are being presented at this time? So I know you've established quite a presence in the region as well. And so if you were to say what some of those recommendations could be and what other US-based organizations could do, what would those recommendations be?
Well, you know, I can tell you that one of the things that we're trying to do is show up in Africa differently than American organizations used to. And that is with a belief in the ability and the talent and the resources that exist in the country to solve the problems of the country, with a fair amount of humility that we don't know the answer. And actually not a ton of conditional resources. So we're bringing the resources to the table. We're trusting the people on the ground, and we believe that they have the answer. I don't know that we've always done it that way, but I think you know, we talked in the early stages that a lot of things have been broken over the last many years, and hopefully we don't build it back the same way. And so this partnership that we've struck is really about us trying to enter differently and trying to move resources differently, not using the structures that are really familiar to us in the United States, but the really hybrid, unusual alliances that exist in Africa, the acknowledgement of culture and tradition, and respecting that. So, you know, we're coming to the table, hopefully with a ton of humility and an extended hand.
Great, thank you. And then one question to the Congressman, and then I would like to turn back to CD to close up. And we have a question from, actually from Franklin from Kenya. And he's asking about the approach of USADF and policies from the US are commendable in assisting development at a grassroots level in Africa. But what work is being done directly and indirectly to support policy formulation in these developing states? So first, I would like to turn that over to the Congressman. I know you've been working on good governance and other aspects of governance across the region as well, and then turn that over to you, CD, to get your perspective on how USADF is working on policy formulation in the region as well.
Well, thank you for the question. We do engage with generally national policy makers. We've done some experimental work, and the organizations we work with, the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, I'm sure known to many of you, these NGOs affiliated with our political parties that work on the ground, they have worked at various governmental levels. Our House Democracy Partnership mainly works at the national level, and our role is to meet these partner parliaments where they are. We're you talk about humility. We have a fair degree of humility about our own system and how well it's working or not working these days, and we understand from the very beginning that democracy is a work in progress, and democracy and democratic representation and institutions are going to take different forms in different settings. Having said that, we do have some values in common, and we try to meet our parliaments where they are. In the case of Kenya, we discovered early on that Kenya was engaged in a project of constitutional revision, adding a new House of Parliament, that there was a great need, a great felt need on the part of the Kenyans for a better budget process. We had a lot of consultation with members and also with technical help in putting together a budget process. We found a lot of interest in how committees work and the kind of hearings and public presentation we make. So it's we're not pushing one particular system, nor are we trying to push one particular policy. But we're assuming that a healthy process with good constituent relationships and with a good use of professional staff, a good connection with think tanks and those who can add expertise and an independence, no matter what the system, a degree of capacity and independence on the part of the parliament, that those will serve whatever policy objectives the representatives undertake.
Great, thank you. And then CD, from your perspective as well, the audience member is interested what USADF is doing in this regard to support policy formation at a local level.
I think it's a great, very important question. I want to lead off where the Congressman left off, and that word around, are we pushing solutions down, or are we pulling solutions out of communities and using those to learn from and then develop our own policies? So USADF takes a participatory approach, and we take that in terms of our community development engagement, but we also take that in terms of how we engage with the Congress to inform them around Africa's needs and challenges, and then take the lead from what Congress is developing. Again, as I mentioned, some legislation that's very specifically focused on Africa, whether it's 20 plus years ago with the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or more recently with Power Africa, or a global initiative like the Young African Leaders Initiative. All of these initiatives focus on Africa's needs and challenges and U.S. government's interest in the region. And so how do we as USADF serve as an intermediary, serve as an interlocutor, serve as a source of information to take US government priorities and sort of say, where do they meet? How do we pull from African communities and learn how these priorities may meet the real needs on the ground, and serving as that conduit to ensure that it's not top down, but it's bottom up driven and bottom up informed, and taking a real local participatory approach. So that's one way to look at it. Another way is a number of African governments. I mean, this is not 25 years ago or even 40 years ago when ADF was established. A number of African governments are developing their own policies and solutions for their own communities. And so it's one thing in terms of policy formation, it's another in terms of implementation and execution. And ADF somewhat serves as an example of how you can implement locally with a mindset that those local entities, those local organizations, they know how. They are given the opportunity to engage. If being engaged and informed around the opportunities that exist and ways in which to work, that they can actually share and teach us how things need to go, and also how those communities can develop, grow, and scale to be real contributors. And so working with the US government, but also working with African governments and reaching underserved communities that are hard even for them to reach. So showing this example, and it becomes an example and a model for African governments to reach underserved, poor, vulnerable populations and their people in a way that is direct, because this new way of looking at development, being bottom-up driven, being localized, it's proven. We know, as Corinne mentioned with the Global Fragility Act, it's written into law now. We know this engagement of local communities and this participatory approach, these community-led models, we know they have transformational change, and how can we do more of it? But it's also, we're learning here in the US about the importance and the way in which it leads to the ultimate resilience building that's needed. But we also are learning that and using that to inform even African governments to reach some of their own communities in new ways. And so I think it's really a spirit of participation, but it is, as Sherrie said, a real sense of humility, and the Congressman said, a sense of humility that we are going in with not the end in mind, but going in asking, how might we? What will it take? This community, what do you need? What are things that you've tried, and where can we be of true assistance? So that participatory approach, that co-creation, that inclusion is really important. And then also, lastly, thinking about this from a pathway that all of us in our different roles and responsibilities, whether it's Dr. Issa and his work in Somalia, whether it's Kindra and what Technoserve is doing, USIP as literally a thinker and a doer in development assistance and peace building, the National Basketball Players Association Foundation with many players throughout the continent who know these local communities, who know who have a commitment and an investment in communities where they've come from to make sure that they are really advancing advance and that more opportunities are presented to them. These are individuals and organizations that are true connections, and having the Congress to support this kind of effort has allowed ADF to be a true contributor and a very important tool in the foreign assistance toolkit, not only for U.S. effective and efficient use of U.S. taxpayer dollars, but also to ensure that the communities that we want to support and we want to help and that we want to scale up and do more, that they are met with the right size solutions that they really need. And so we're grateful for the opportunity for collaboration, and we're grateful for the opportunity to do more to look at African-owned, designed, and delivered solutions for African development.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that really ties everything together well, and the importance of all of these partnerships, and also the importance of the projects being community-led and community-driven. And the impacts are really compelling. And thank you for your work and for everyone joining us today and sharing your experience, your expertise, and your ideas as we go forward. This has been a great conversation. And again, thank you to the audience as well for joining us, and encourage you and invite you to continue the conversation with all of us. So thank you again, CD, and thank you to the USADF for your support, and all of you for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Unfortunately, we are out of time.
Thanks, everyone. Happy holidays. Be safe, be well. Thank you so much.
And again, thank you to all of you for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And we hope your interest has been piqued, and you join us online and you look into our report as well, where you can find some more of the key findings, and that's at investingafricanresilience.com, where you can find the results from our research. But thank you again to our distinguished speakers for joining us today. We appreciate your time, and thank you for sharing all of your expertise. So it's a busy season, and we know all of you have constraints on your time, but we have one more virtual dialogue this week, and we invite you to join us on Friday, where we will continue the spotlight on Africa from the point of view of global security and peace building. So this Friday, on December 18th, we'll have a dynamic discussion featuring Ambassador Jerry Matthews-Matila, who is the UN Permanent Representative for South Africa, and will assess South Africa's leadership on the UN Security Council and the country's strategic vision for the African continent in an increasingly polarized world. So thank you again for joining us, and you can find this and information about all of our events on foreignpolicy.com/events. Thank you so much for tuning in. Stay safe, and we'll see you soon.